Hello and welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty with Scott Tregurtha, where we help critical thinkers by giving you the most true and accurate information we can find, which they should be giving you on mainstream media, but are not. So you can decide for yourself and take control of your liberty, your freedom, and your future. And now, here is Scott Tregurtha.
Hello, everybody. President Trump used the term manifest destiny in his inaugural address this past January. So in this episode, I'm going to play Tony Papert's presentation of a video in which statesman Lyndon Larouche spoke of our true manifest destiny, which actually seems to outline much of what Trump is actually doing, as if he knew someone would come along and do it. The fact is, what Mr. Larouche was saying in his speech way back in the year 2000 is that this is something we needed to do back then, but we did not. So I'm very thankful for the fact that a man named Donald Trump came along with the wherewithal, fortitude, and willingness to actually put this into place. Watch and listen to this video of Lyndon Larouche, introduced by Tony Papert of Promethean Action, and learn more about who we are, what our forefathers were, and how President Trump is leading the way for all of us to bring this into fruition so we can finally have our true manifest destiny.
At a time when a whole new world is opening up, thanks to Donald Trump, the movement he's created, including the people on this call, we've got to go to basic fundamental principles to deal with the current situation. And for Larouche, the fundamental principle was the manifest destiny of the United States of America. And this was not primarily, as you'll see in a minute, this was not primarily geographical, but spiritual. And it's governed the successive stages of the unfolding of the real America as it is in the present and it will in the future. So we'd take you back now to January 2000, at the end of the Clinton administration and the beginning of the election campaign, which ultimately hit Al Gore against George W. Bush Jr., if you want to call him that. Lyndon Larouche was campaigning for the Democratic nomination for president, as he had in 5 elections before 2000. And he was speaking in Boston on January 14th, 2000. So in just a second, we'll be back in Boston in January 14th, 2000 with Lyndon Larouche.
I'd chosen to do this in New England for a number of reasons. First of all, because the issue of manifest destiny as a debate over the foreign policy of the United States is the leading issue today. The currents, the opposing currents on that debate at the end of the last century and the beginning of this century, those issues remain today more important than ever before. And they're more important than ever before because we're in one of the worst crises worldwide we've seen in any recent century. And this policy has to be understood. Unfortunately, very few candidates who are running for president have even a glimmer of ideas of what this means. Most American citizens no longer know what the issue is or what its practical implications are. And tonight I will attempt to make that in a shortened version clear to you. This is New England, a good place to choose for dealing with this because it was here in New England as defined in 1630 by John Winthrop, the founder of New England, otherwise known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony at that time, that the foundations of the states of Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, and Rhode Island were made under the leadership of Winthrop and those associated with him. From that point on, there was a certain policy about the developing of a nation in North America, starting from the Massachusetts colony. That policy has continued as a viable policy to the present day. It did not, however, start entirely here. It was a concept which was brought to North America by Europe. It was a policy which, in one form or the other, already dominated the late 15th century, the so-called century of the Renaissance. And it was from the Renaissance that the ideas of our present, or what should be our present foreign policy, and what has been at our best times in the past, was founded from those ideas. From the time of the Roman Empire, at the time of the birth of Christ, civilization in the Mediterranean region had collapsed, degenerated, and continued in a degenerate form of one degree or another for about 15 centuries. But with the birth of Christ and the leadership role of his apostles, it was a new conception of man and society, which is based largely upon the foundations of the classical Greek tradition, especially the ideas associated with the work of Plato. And you'll find in the apostles, especially in the Gospel of St. John or the epistles of Paul, you'll find this conception of man on which our later foreign policy here was founded. You find it established there, especially, for example, in Paul's epistle of 1 Corinthians in chapter 13, where this concept of man was set forward. The idea is that man is not an animal. Man, unlike any other species, is capable of willfully increasing our species' power in and over the universe. This is possible because we have a power which is called technically cognition, the power to discover universal physical and other principles, to prove that those principles are correct, and to apply those principles in ways which enable us to increase man's power in and over the universe and to improve the conditions of life of the human being. This quality in the person, the quality of cognition, combined with the determination to do good in the sense of increasing man's power in the universe, in the sense of improving the conditions of life of human beings through the use of this power, was called in the ancient Greek agape. It is a term which was the subject of the original Greek version of Paul's 1 Corinthians, notably 1 Corinthians 13. For a long period of time, almost 14 centuries, from the birth of Christ, there was a struggle by Christians to establish a society which was consistent with that principle. That is, that all men and women are equally made in the image of the Creator by virtue of having this power of cognition, the quality of agape, the potential to increase man's power in and over the universe, and to improve the conditions of life through the discovery of these kinds of principles, which no animal could do. And thus we must have a society fit, a form of society fit for that quality of creature, man, cast in the image of the Creator. And it was only in the 15th century, in what a period called the Golden Renaissance, that the first successful steps were made to actually establish this kind of society for which people had struggled and dreamed over the intervening 14 centuries. This developed in the middle of the 15th century around an event which was called the Council of Florence. But the enemies, the Roman feudal tradition, tried to stop the emergence of this form of society which we call today the sovereign nation state. And therefore powerful forces centered in Venice organized a revolt against the efforts to form this kind of society. The first such nation states based on this principle were France under Louis XI. And following that, modeled on the success of Louis XI in France, Henry VII in England founded the first modern nation state in England, though his son and successor, Henry VIII, as we all know, erred. He stepped in the wrong direction a few times. He had a Monica Lewinsky in his life. So, as a result of the struggle in Europe, and remember Europe was dominated from about 1517 until the middle of the 17th century, that is 1648, by religious wars. Those who opposed the nation state in Europe tried to defend the old feudal order in one way or another by pitting parts of Europe against each other in religious wars. And terrible religious wars dominated Europe during most of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th century, until the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, it was under these conditions that people in England and elsewhere conceived of establishing a new nation state on the continent of North America. The first such venture was the founding of New England by that name by John Winthrop in 1630. And it's from that that the United States came. Now, Massachusetts was not always good. New England was not always good. It deteriorated. But nonetheless, what was done under the leadership of Winthrop and collaborators of his, such as the Mather family in education and so forth, this was the foundation of what was continued by Benjamin Franklin during the 18th century in leading this nation, or what became this nation, to founding the United States. At a later point, the question came up, and it came up around the question of the Constitution in the 1780s and the 1789 in particular. What was the mission and what was the purpose by which we as a nation should define ourselves? How should we define our relations to other nations in particular, but to the world in general? What was our purpose and our mission, which should be a kind of our law as it pertained to what purpose would guide us in dealing with other parts of the world? Who has greater authority in the state, with the exception of what de Gaulle tried to do with the Fifth Republic, President of the United States, which was an abortive effort because when he went out of power, the Fifth Republic degenerated. European governments are not true republics. There has never been a true republic in Europe, not since the Greeks at least, or since the efforts in the 15th century. Why? What happened in Europe is, under the impact of the American Revolution, the idea of freedom received a jolt, and there were continuing efforts in the late part of the 18th century and the 19th century to develop republics in Europe. But the Europeans never succeeded in building a republic. What they built was something different. They built movements which moved for democratization, to democratize society. And thus what they did is they put pressure on the existing form of government, which was a feudal form of government based on a monarch or somebody who took the place of a monarch, a permanent bureaucracy which stayed no matter what the government was otherwise, and a parliament. Now, the parliament was a feudal institution. It was not a republican institution. And always, as you can see, if you look at the history of European governments, the monarch, the king, or the bureaucracy as such could overthrow the parliament at any time they wanted to. All they would do is form a parliamentary crisis, and they dumped the government. So the government had no real power. The government had power to lobby, to pressure the state, to pressure those who rule society, but no power to actually make policy, power to help shape policy, power to pressure. So what we had was in Europe was a democratic reform in a feudal system. And that's what the governments of Europe are to the present day. Look at their way their governments function. They are not true republics. We are the only true republic in that sense. We are the ones who bear this principle. So it was understood by the best people in our society. Two things. First of all, that what we are did not come from the ground in the United States. It did not come from the frontier as such. It did not come from bar rooms on the frontier or from cowboys and Indians shooting each other. This is not, which is what Teddy Roosevelt thought it came from, or said it came from. But he was a great liar, so you can never believe what he said anyway. But the United States, as a republic, came from the greatest thinkers of Europe, typified by people like John Winthrop, typified by others who came here and brought the best ideas of Europe here with the hope that on this ground those ideas could grow up and flourish as they had not been able to grow up and flourish in the same degree in Europe. For example, in the end of the 18th century, the United States, our republic, was called a temple of liberty and beacon of hope for all mankind. That our function as a nation state, as something produced here through the best influence of the best ideas of European civilization, would create a form of society which would be an inspiration and a friend to all humanity in bringing forth on this planet a system of sovereign nation states which would cooperate for their mutual benefit in an ecumenical way. Now, what does that mean, ecumenical, in this sense? You have a whole history of ecumenicism, particularly in the Mediterranean region, because first of all, you had Judaism and Christianity. And you had the great Jewish writer, rabbi as he's called, Philo of Alexandria, who was a friend of the Apostle Peter, who wrote very important writings, who actually helped to civilize the Jewish religion at that point, which had been a captive of Babylon and the Romans at that time. And he laid down a principle of ecumenicism. Later in the 15th century, the same Nicholas Cusa to whom I referred wrote a paper called De Pace Fide, or the Peace of Faith, in which he has a dialogue among Christians, Jews, and Islamic and Muslims on what the relations must be among the people who represent these different religions. What is the common basis to avoid religious war and to have a peace among the faiths based on the adoption of certain common principles? It's the same principle of Christianity. We call it the principle of reason. The fact, if we can discover the truth, if we can discover a principle of nature that we call a universal physical principle, if we can prove that principle to be valid, demonstrate it to be universally valid, then we know by the power we have to make that discovery, there's something going on which is not formal logic, in our minds, the power of reason. What we say, therefore, if we have a difference with others on religion or on culture, we say we must reason together. We must use this power of cognition, the principles which are made known to us through this sharing of this power of cognition, to recognize whatever our differences are in particular faith, as a given faith, that we must work together on the basis of reason. We must reason together, find a true universal principle, adopt it commonly, and work together on the basis of reason. That civil society must not be a religious society, but civil society must be of an ecumenical form based on this principle of reason. And that is the way that we will have to deal with cultures such as China, or the culture of India, or other cultures which come from roots other than European civilization. In the case of European or Mediterranean civilization, in dealing with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, you don't have may have problems and struggles, but you shouldn't have them, because of a common root, you have an easier task in coming together and adopting common principles. Whereas you go into other parts of the world, you don't have the same cultural background. Therefore, you must look deeper to the principle of reason to finding a common foundation for working together to a common interest. That it must be a voluntary association based on reason teaching us that this is the thing we must do together. And civil society must be based on that. For example, we referred recently in things we published to one of our heroes, Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn in Germany, in the middle of in the 18th century, played a key part in creating what is the modern classical German culture. You might say that classical German culture is a Jewish conspiracy. Well, in a sense it was, but he was part of it. He was also the great liberator of Judaism from persecution by these ideas. One of his most famous writings was on this subject. He remained to his death an Orthodox Jew. And he said he would, always. But he said at the same time, society must be based on the principle of reason. Political society, civil society must be based on the common principle of reason. And that we in the United States, in particular, must exemplify that. The principle of reason. Not religious bigotry, but the principle of reason. That if something is true, we can discover the truth, and we can test it as to which is true and which is false in universal principle. And we can other than that, we must dedicate ourselves to the truth even when we don't yet know it. That is, if we don't know what the answer is, we can at least dedicate ourselves to the urge and desire and method of finding the truth. And that's what our society is based on. So the conception among all the greatest thinkers of American politics was in that direction. They may have said something slightly different than what I've just said, but we would all agree among us. If they were alive and standing here today, we would agree. And Blaine would agree, even though I have some differences with some of the things Blaine said. But we would agree. And that the function of this nation is to be still, to become again the beacon of hope and temple of liberty for mankind, which is not right now. Not even for our own citizens, for the 80% in the lower income brackets. It's not. But it must become that again. That's our purpose. That's the function we have among nations. That's the role that the President of the United States must have in dealing with other nations, in leading this nation, in its negotiations with other powers, to come to those forms of collaboration and agreements which are consistent with that. We must call ourselves that, we must see ourselves as that, and we must function to that effect. We're not doing it now. What's the situation now? We're in a terrible situation. Not only the United States is in an economic crisis, and if we weren't stealing from other countries, we'd know how bad our poverty is. The United States is using its power and the power of the British Commonwealth combined to steal massively from other nations. For example, you wouldn't have the boom on Wall Street unless for the past 14 years the United States had been looting Japan. We have been stealing from Japan. Japan is printing money and issuing it at 0.25% interest overnight. This money, Japanese yen, which are being issued by the Bank of Japan at 0.25% interest, are being borrowed by Americans and by Europeans and others. These then they convert them into dollars. They use the yen to buy dollars. Then they come into our markets and they jack the markets up with financial speculation, like this great internet bubble is now ready to pop. Right? We have in this country, we have a deficit, a national so-called current account deficit, that we as a nation are spending $300 to $400 billion a year more than we are taking in. We are taking that money from other countries. We are living not on what we produce, but less and less. We're living upon slave labor or virtual slave labor from other countries. We don't produce our goods, less and less. We get cheap goods from other countries through virtual slave labor abroad. And our companies buy those cheap goods and dump those things on us. And that's how we get along. And look at our supermarket malls, for example. They're disgusting. No decent goods. Look at the fact that our satellites don't go up regularly because they don't work so well anymore. Because our engineers and our firms are no longer as competent as they used to be. Because we're not a productive nation anymore. Our farmers, generally the real farmers, the family farmers, are going bankrupt. When farmers who are now in their 60s and 70s die off, what's going to happen to the farms? There are no replacements for them, except cheap labor working on company farms. Gone. Where are our industries? Look at New Hampshire, for example. How do people in New Hampshire live? We used to have industries here. We used to have respectable industries. We used to have some farming here, which could get by. It was always a rather poor state relative to Massachusetts, but a proud state. We used to make jokes when we lived up here about the Massachusetts drivers and things like that. But it was that kind of, we were proud, but we had some dignity. Now we take in people's laundry. New Hampshire lives by tourism in the summer and tourism in the ski season, and a few other things. That New Hampshire overall as an economy is no longer a viable economy. You look at what's happened in Massachusetts. The collapse of the industrial potential of this area, or the technological potential. It's being destroyed. So this is true of the United States as a whole. We are being a self-destroyed nation. And the bills are piling up. Since Carter, since the middle of the 1970s, our national debt has become a cancer. Our total indebtedness has become a cancer, which is about to crush us. When Japan goes down, as it may soon, or when Russia goes down, or a combination of them, Brazil goes down, Mexico goes down, Ecuador's already gone, there's a crisis building up in Europe. We will go down too. And you will have people who are now in the upper 20% of income brackets working as middle management at $60,000, $70,000 a year with stock option bonanzas, which they're using to buy $300 to $400, $600,000 million shacks, top paper shacks with Hollywood frontiers on them. Shacks that'll collapse if people don't stay inside to keep the walls straight. It's terrible stuff. Huh? This is what we face. We can turn white shirts into brown shirts very easily in this country. You have people who have no skills really, who are middle management, who are generally psycho managers more than goods managers. And when they lose their jobs, when the internet bubble collapses, not all the internet industries will go down, but some of them are just fly-by-night operations essentially. And when they go down, these people who've got $600,000 to $1 million mortgages on these tar paper shacks with a little bit of glorification and fancy faucets, when they go down, those mortgages will be unpayable. They'll be migrating looking for a job. And we're going to have panic in this country, not so much among the people who are already poor, because they've gotten used to poverty, but these people will go crazy. And if we don't provide a solution for this problem here, a Roosevelt-style solution, we're going to have white shirts turn into brown shirts. And you're going to have the rage which you see in the death penalty cases, the finality rule in death penalty cases, as particularly in Virginia and Texas. Or now in Florida, we've got the both Bushes want to kill everybody. Just, I don't know, for pleasure or whatnot. They might as well open a Roman circus and just get them out there and kill each other or something. But a meanness in the American people, an absolute meanness. You turn that kind of thing loose with the absolute lack of morality as we used to understand morality as morality of person to person. Drive these people into a rage, and you're going to have the brown shirts or their equivalent stampeding through the society. destroying us, tearing us apart. So we have a crisis. Since last August, when the financial crisis, the Russian crisis hit, we've been getting into wars. Started with Al Gore and his friends. Clinton had a problem with the Lewinsky case, actually with the Star Chamber. He was distracted. In the absence, while the president was distracted by this impeachment process, from last summer on through February, Al Gore and his friends inside the Gore administration began organizing wars together with the British government. You had the bombing of a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. There was no reason to do that. They were not involved in terrorism or producing something. It was done because Al Gore and Madeleine Albright wanted it done. You had other incidents. You had Al Gore's fanatical speech, for example, in Kuala Lumpur, attacking the Prime Minister of Malaysia in a way that even a Nazi diplomat wouldn't have dared do in his time. It was filthy behavior. The same crowd. Then you had the forcing of the renewed bombing of Iraq, pushed through by Al Gore, not the president, by Al Gore and his friends, Madeleine Albright and so forth. Then you had us go into a no-win, stupid war, organized by the same people, behind the back of the president, in the case of the so-called Kosovo War, or the war against Yugoslavia, the bombing war, which has simply destroyed the territory. It solved no problem. The conditions are far worse than when the war started, throughout the entire region, including Kosovo. Now, the same forces, the heirs of Bush and Thatcher, have launched terrorists internationally, headquartered in London. They've launched them in Transcaucasia. They're launched wars between India and Pakistan, virtual wars, now ongoing, and similar things throughout the world. So you're in a situation which reminds you, in a sense, of what happened during the 1930s, during the period of the 1930s depression. That at the same time that the economic situation is ready to blow, we've got this chaos. Threat of wars. We have already the threat of a deflationary collapse. A 60 to 80% collapse of the stock market, for example, could occur at any time. Nobody knows when, because political factors will decide when and how things happen. We have a hyperinflationary tendency in real estate and elsewhere already building up, reminding us of Weimar Germany in 1923. That could go that way. We've got wars and chaos spreading. We've got the two biggest dummies in politics running as leading presidential candidates in the Democratic and Republican Party. Either of these idiots in power, whether they're just dummies or not, is a threat to our national security. That's our situation. Now, what's the solution? That means we're coming to a point in foreign policy. This financial system, this monetary system, this crazy thing that was started in '71 with Nixon and the floating exchange rate system, this is about to come to an end, one way or another. We're in a time in which the people who represent money, big money, are hysterical. What their plans are not to have Wall Street go up forever. You've got people who have bought into what they call income streams. People bought up raw materials, especially through London. The mega mergers are grabs. They take all the money in sight, and they'll never pay the bills. But somebody behind the scenes, who's behind the money grab, has an angle on grabbing those assets when these mega merger organizations go bankrupt. This means gold mines, it means petroleum, it means the communications industry, which is being grabbed up now, the idea of the communications industry being indispensable. Anybody who controls communications after the system goes belly up will be able to control that income stream as a monopoly, or as a syndicate that controls it as a monopoly. We have the same thing with our power system. We're running out of power. But people are moving like Enron to grab up power from companies, power companies that are going bankrupt. They'll control your energy, control communications, control energy, control food supplies, control raw materials. The things on which life depends. To control those things mean you control whatever income stream exists when the thing goes belly up financially. And they're already moving for it. Yeah, the suckers are still betting on Wall Street. They're still betting on these crazy stocks, betting on these financial ventures. They're counting on their mutual funds, their money manager accounts. They think they're making money on it. They'll be wiped out. We don't know exactly when, but it's coming. No, the smart guys are not doing that. They're letting the suckers do it, especially the suckers in the upper 20% of income brackets. They're grabbing up around the world. They're grabbing assets, petroleum assets, mineral assets, communication system assets, power system assets, water assets, food monopoly assets. They're grabbing them up. And when the malls go bankrupt, when the suburban projects go belly up, they'll be there controlling the income stream and controlling the world. That's their idea. They're mad and greedy. That would mean a new dark age. We've seen this before in human history, in European history in particular, this kind of thing. And if we don't stop it, don't prevent it, it's going to mean hell. Hell on earth, at least for decades to come. So what's the solution? The solution is, of course, that we have to take Roosevelt-style decisions in answer to the crisis. We have to act. We have to create a new monetary system. We have to put the thing into bankruptcy reorganization. We have to make sure that people don't die on the streets because their pensions aren't paid, because their savings accounts disappear. We've got to keep order so normal life continues. We've got to improve employment and production. We've got to do those things as emergency actions immediately. We've got to prevent chaos and bring back order and start to put ourselves back together again. We can't do it all by ourselves. We have to do it with other nations, or at least some other nations. Now, when you mean some other nations, well, most of the world's population, where is it? Most of the world's population is in Asia. India, Indonesia, Malaysia, other parts of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and then also Africa. This is where the great part of the human population is. Then we have ruined areas of the world which could be great and prosperous, with good labor forces, at least the remnants of them. In South and Central America, many of these countries have good labor forces. We're under good conditions. So we have people with whom we should cooperate and can cooperate to put this planet in some kind of order. And this brings us back to the question of manifest destiny. Does the United States still have the function of being a temple of liberty and beacon of hope for these nations of the world? And can we do that by making sure we do it also internally to restore the nation internally as a temple of liberty and beacon of hope, in order to give it the moral authority to be a temple of liberty and beacon of hope worldwide? Could it be done? Yes, it could be done. Let's take a case of my own and Helga's and our friends' foreign policy, which we've been practicing. This is not something we dreamed up, it's something we've been practicing. I tried to, when, it's out of New Hampshire, when the New Hampshire primary campaign in 1980, when I was sitting at a table at a gun club event, which had about 2,500 people up there in Concord area, at the what used to be the old New Hampshire Highway Hotel. And because we were arranged at the table as presidential candidates in alphabetical order by surname, Ronald Reagan was at the end of the table and I was next to him. And you had all these other funny fellows there too. So Ronald and I got into a little bit of discussion. There wasn't much substance to it. It was just a discussion. But I saw when he put his speech together, a 5-minute speech, which we were each allotted to do, I saw the way he did it and realized the man is not as dumb as he was supposed to be. He had problems, but he wasn't stupid. And I recognized that from talking to him. So when he became president, or had been elected, then I got into a conversation with some of the people who were going to form, or in the process of forming, the new administration, as a Democrat. And they say, well, what's your agenda? You know how politicians talk. And a whole bunch of them, including Richard Richards and so forth, what's your agenda? So I would discuss with these people the things that I thought the United States ought to do. And they would say, we like that, we don't like that, we like that, we don't like that. So we would go around. Helga went with me to some of these meetings, and we'd meet various people. And we talk with the Democrats. I would say, look to the Democrats, leading Democrats in the Congress. This is the way I think we ought to deal with the Reagan administration. We ought to move quickly because there's some bad things over there, but we ought to move quickly to find common denominators which are good for the nation and get this thing going in that direction now. Well, one of the results was that at the end of 1981, I had a project, and the question was discussing with the Russians, or the Soviets then. So to make short of the thing, I got involved in, on behalf of the Reagan administration, in discussing with representatives of the top Soviet circles on my policy for dealing with the weapons crisis and related matters. So that led to eventually, about a year later, to Reagan making the famous speech announcing his SDI on March 23rd, 83. Now that went awry afterward, and I was out of the picture soon because the enemies of mine got into it pretty quick, and they made a mess of it. So what they're talking about missile defense systems today is mostly nonsense, even though there were some people in the background who knew what we were talking about. But in some of that time, and earlier businesses and dealing with non-aligned nations and developing nations generally, I've been pretty much involved with the question of foreign policy matters over a period of about at least 3 decades. And I know a lot of people, if you look at some of my endorsements from various parts of the world, from leading figures from South America, Europe, Asian countries, and so forth, you'll see a reflection of the fact that I have been a significant figure on their horizon in terms of relations with the United States and others over this period of time. And in many of these countries, there are people who wish I were president. They think it'd be good for them and good for the world, and they say so. So I know these countries. I know what we can do. And I know that if I were president, I could deal with this problem. The problem is that we must have an emergency action to put the present monetary system, which isn't functioning, into bankruptcy reorganization by governments, by sovereign governments. In other words, we all agree that each government will take its chunk of the problem and they'll put that chunk through their own bankruptcy reorganization. But they will coordinate our efforts to get something out of this which will be stable for all of us. Now, obviously, if you're going to make a sudden move like that, you've got to base your move on something which is a proven precedent. You can't come up with some completely newfangled thing that nobody ever heard of before and expect the people, as well as the politicians, to suddenly accept that as a plan of action. You've got to say, here's where we went wrong. Here's where we were doing things that were working, relatively speaking, and here's where we went wrong and we began to do the wrong thing. That's why we're in the mess. Now let's go back to the point in the road where we made the wrong turn, and let's begin to move from there. So this idea of a new Bretton Woods is very simple. We had, from 44 through 58 and somewhat beyond, we had, with all its faults, we had a monetary system and a general economic policy which worked. It may not have worked the way we liked it, but it worked relative to anything we've seen since. We had recovery of the world from the war, economic recovery. We had the Marshall Plan. We had a rebuilding of the United States economy, based largely upon Marshall Plan exports into Europe. So we built up our industries in helping Europe develop and Japan develop through Marshall Plan cooperation and through that kind of policy, through the Bretton Woods agreements, the old Bretton Woods agreements. Sovereign nation state, gold reserve, fixed parities, tariffs which were protective for all countries, each and all countries, trade agreements of that type, and so forth. Low interest, long-term loans to promote international trade, and that sort of thing. It worked. With all the failures, it worked. With all the problems, it worked, relative to anything we've seen since 1971. If we had never stopped doing that, we wouldn't have the world financial and economic crises or the U.S. crisis we have today. So it should be obvious to nations who've gone through this kind of experience of the present IMF system. They all know it doesn't work. They all know it's destroying us. Well, let's get rid of it. Well, you don't ask one nation by itself to get rid of it. You try to get a group of nations together to say, we will jointly agree This thing has to go. And if you have the majority of the human race in the deal with you, it's likely to fly. And if the United States is a partner in it, the President of the United States, it's likely to fly. Particularly if the American people at that time perceive a major crisis which needs some fixing. And our argument to the American people is, this is what worked. We've got the facts to prove it. You've got senior citizens who remember how it worked, who can remind you of it and tell you about it. That worked. What you're doing now has failed. Now let's gently go back to the turn of the road where we made the wrong turn. Go back to the Bretton Woods model, maybe change the relations among states a bit, but do basically the same thing. Go in the same direction. Learn the lessons of the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, and go back to that. Now what does that mean? As I dealt with this yesterday in a press conference in Concord, where the question came up, particularly from one of our friends who is in the machine tool area, how do we do this? Well, I said that you can't just have an economy and say, set up a master plan of how it's going to work and have it work. You've got to have a national mission. You've got to have a sense of purpose. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Well, the general condition of this planet is as follows. Presuming we've gone back to the old Bretton Woods model, or something like it, same principles, the same general idea. Now, how are we going to build our way globally out of the crisis? How are we going to have a mutual advantage, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, South America, Central America, Europe, the United States? How are we going to have a deal that is equitable to all? What do we have to do? Well, the basic problem of the planet is that when Roosevelt died, we didn't do what he intended to do. That is to rip up all vestiges of Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French colonialism and imperialism, and end the domination of this planet by a free trade system. That was Roosevelt's intention, as he stated plainly and repeatedly to Winston Churchill. But when Roosevelt died, Winston Churchill won, and the Washington gang took orders from Churchill, along with the people who worked for the Churchill, and they put the policy in. So as a result of that, we did not address the question which Roosevelt intended to do, is to transform what had been the colonial region of the world, or semi-colonial, under free trade domination and looting, and transform this into a collection of sovereign nation-state republics, which would be in partnership with the United States in particular, as well as Europe, and to try to build this world up so that you had a just economic conditions throughout the world as a whole, to bring nations together as sovereign nation states so we would not create a situation where we look forward, in Roosevelt's view and mine at the time when I was in service, to look forward to a world where we wouldn't have another terrible world war. And the way to do that is to have a just economic system and a just political system on which sovereign nation states have a partnership, in a sovereign partnership, in terms of doing things together which are in the common interest. Now, what does that mean today? That means that in countries like China or India or Southeast Asia or South America now, Central America, you have nations which could not by themselves, with their own resources, recover in time to meet the desperate condition of all of their population. One case is China. China has now currently a rate of growth, annual rate of growth, about 7 to 8% per year. Maybe 8.5. It depends how you calculate. But that sounds very good, considering the fact that the United States has no growth, really no net growth. You take the hot air out of our financial system, we are contracting, as manifest by the fact that we can no longer afford the health care we used to have. They tell us we can no longer afford the pensions we used to have. We can no longer have the educational system we used to have. We can no longer afford anything that we used to have. So obviously we've become much poorer, and anybody who's telling us that things have become better is kidding themselves or blowing hot air, blowing bubbles, as they're doing on Wall Street. So it's not enough to have a certain rate of growth. You've got to be able to sustain the growth. Now you can have growth in the inland area of China, for example, where very poor people live. The Chinese economy is mostly located on the coastal areas or near the coast, traditionally. Inland It's poor, very poor, desperately poor. Among the poorest parts of the world. They're just better organized than some other parts of the world, but they're very poor. And the social stability of China depends not merely on improving the economic conditions of these people, but improving the cultural conditions. And the improvement in economic conditions is necessary to improve cultural conditions. It means you have to have higher standard of living, more education, all the things that go with that. Well, they're not going to be able to do that without a lot of high technology. You cannot sustain growth at high rates without also increasing the average productive powers of labor as measured in physical terms. We can do that. We have on this planet the ability to produce the technologies which used by developing countries such as China or India or South American countries or Africa. We have the technologies which on the long term will enable these countries to sustain growth, real growth, on a stable basis. We used to be machine tool exporters. We used to be high technology exporters. Europe, especially continental Europe, used to be high technology exporters. Present-day Russia has some industries, the scientific, military, scientific, industrial complex, which could produce machine tools, capable of doing it. Japan has a machine tool capability. If we, the nations, which have a machine tool type of capability for science driver machine tool development, we can supply the developing sector of the world with the tools and the technology which they need to increase their productive powers of labor per capita and per square kilometer. That solves their problem. We need to employ our people. We need to get back to work. What should we do? We should build those industries and farms and so forth. We need to maintain our own national economic security at home. But what should we export? What should we concentrate on in terms of export? We should concentrate, together with Europe, together with Japan, and other countries which have a high technology capability, of building up what? Our universities, particularly science education. Our university laboratories, which test discovery and development of scientific principles. Our machine tool capabilities, including the highly specialized ones that develop the new principles, including the ones that produce the applications, the sophisticated machine tools, and including the mass production machine tools that go with that. And helping these countries get also the supporting repair capabilities and maintenance capabilities in the area where the industries are developing, which they don't have in these countries now, at least not adequately. That should be our perspective for the next quarter century, next 30 years. We should rebuild ourselves, not only to put our own shop at home in repair, but to orient ourselves using this aerospace industry as a focal point of driver for this thing. To retool the United States with a mission. We, together with other countries which can do this, are going to adopt the mission of helping the rest of the world transform itself to end this kind of deprivation and misery which affrights us and disgusts us. And thus we, those nations, and we, should be able to meet together to come to the kind of terms which will be durable, because they'll be beneficial over a long period of time to come. We have to understand our manifest destiny. Our manifest destiny lies in classical Greek civilization, its unique contribution to global civilization. It lies in the role of Christianity, especially the apostles, like John and Paul, in taking this Greek classical legacy and using this as the tool of Christianity to improve the condition of mankind, as the Renaissance did later. We need to develop the nation state. The idea that a national government has no moral authority except as it is founded on an absolute commitment to promote and defend the general welfare of all of its people, including their posterity. It's the only right that a government has to rule. Otherwise, it's simply some group of people that treats the government and the people as their personal property and passes down laws accordingly. But the only foundation for law is the principle of the general welfare, that all human beings are equally made in the image of the Creator. It is our obligation to promote their general welfare so defined as creatures of cognition and reason, to develop and to cultivate their powers of cognition and reason, to develop all children, to develop all adults equally, and call that the general welfare, to improve the condition of the present and future generations, the general welfare. That is the only moral authority and the chief responsibility of legitimate government. Our concern is to have on this planet the emergence of governments which correspond to this principle of the general welfare, which is the foundation of law in the preamble of our Constitution, of our constitutional law. And to make that commitment, define that as our being the temple of liberty, make that the definition of our being a beacon of hope, and let us reach out to other nations with that message, with that commitment, with that purpose, and say, let's end this nonsense. Let's learn the lesson. Let's deal with the crisis. And let us, in the process, to show this is no novel idea, let us understand the Greek classic. Let us understand the mission of the apostles. Let us understand the accomplishments of the 15th century Renaissance. Let us understand the achievements of the great scientists and others who struggled to make the Renaissance possible, including Abelard or Charlemagne or Dante Alighieri and others who came before that, who made it possible. Let us remember that and let them live in us. This is no wild idea. We are simply affirming the proven principles of history, and the history of the United States in particular. Let us project that. Let us encourage our children, our citizens, to project that. When they say, what do you are? You're an American citizen. What does that mean? Other countries have citizens. What do you mean by your being an American citizen? What does it mean? What's your mission? What's your commitment? What's your standard for picking the politicians you elect? What do you expect them to do? Where do you expect them to stand? On some bite-sized slogan they put out? Some phony gimmick? Some sideshow? Bula bula? Or do you want someone who thinks like that? Who you can trust because they are committed to that? To educate our children so that when they reach maturity, they're that kind of a person. When each person can finally see themselves in what I call the simultaneity of eternity. Not an unusual term, but one rarely used. That once we understand our nature, we understand that we are made in the image of the Creator, each equally so. We must cultivate or redeem that quality which is within us, given to us at birth. We must relive the acts of reason, the discovery of universal principle, which have been passed down to us for us to re-experience and absorb in ourselves. We are short-lived. We are born and we shall die, all of us. Then what is the meaning of our life as our human life? Is it not to assimilate and cultivate in ourselves those qualities which define us as human, to absorb the gifts of reason from preceding generation, from history, to utilize those and preserve and defend those gifts of reason, to add something to that for future generations, so that when we pass on, we have retained a permanent place in the span of eternity. That is the natural capability and also the right of every human being. Not to be an animal that is born and dies, that has pleasure in the meantime. The right of every human being is to live in such a way that they, in their own way, can have their powers of reason cultivated, can find something good to do for humanity, so that they can die with a smile on their face, because they die with the assurance that in the life they have secured a permanent place, an identity for themselves, in the simultaneity of eternity. That's the commitment we must have. That is the spark which was flourished inside us and must radiate from us so that we become a true beacon of hope and temple of liberty for all mankind. That's what all of my predecessors in this political profession, who were good people, thought and dreamed. That's what Blaine, in his own way, from Maine, dreamed. That's what John Winthrop, the founder of the New England, dreamed. That's what Benjamin Franklin attempted to do. That's what Cotton Mather preached, and preached to others. That's what Lincoln represented. That's what Garfield represented. That's what McKinley represented. That's what Cleveland didn't represent. That's what Wilson didn't represent. That's what Coolidge didn't represent. That's what Roosevelt, in his own imperfect way, tried to represent. That's what poor Kennedy was assassinated, was groping to try to represent too. All the best people at least tried to represent that in their own way. And that for us, as Americans, when we were good, was always for us our choice of manifest destiny. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this recording, as others very much need this information. And for even more information on the subjects of Lyndon Larouche and Promethean action, an organization helping in every way possible Donald Trump to execute our true manifest destiny, please go to www.prometheanaction.com. And of course, if you have any questions or want more information on Larouche, Promethean action, and other political and economic related type news items, please go to the resources page of my website, www.takecontrolofyourliberty.com. You can also connect with me there or simply email me at scott@takecontrolofyourliberty.com. And until next time, remember to take control of your liberty, because you don't want anyone doing that but you.